one of the main preoccupations with people is there a meaning to life? Um, I don't know if Schopenhauer is like directly tackling that question, but I do think that it's kind of like a something you can derive from what he's saying, right? So he has this really cool like image, which is I'll just read it. If we can compare life to a circular track of glowing coals, with a few cool places, which track we had unceasingly to run, the cool place where he is just now standing, or which he sees close ahead of him, gives consolation to someone caught up in delusion. And he goes on running the course. But someone who penetrating the principium individuationis is cognizant of the essence of things in themselves, and thereby of the whole, is no longer receptive to such consolation. He sees himself simultaneously in all places and steps out of it. So that kind of image, like with your grocery shopping example, like the person who goes about their life and they get stuck in all these meaningless tasks. They don't really think about those tasks in terms of the whole of their life, but they're kind of just like, I want my food, I want to go home and relax. And so they view that as like the burning part of the track. And then they view the cool part when they get home as like the everything that they're working for. So they're kind of like, they're not viewing their life in the totality, but just kind of like an instance to instance. What am I trying to get? And so they can put up with it in a way. And so, that's not so much like a moral question, but more so like the meaning question. But I think it is related in a way.
Yeah, I think a lot of people do derive this sort of like, I don't know, I mean, I've seen people almost lump Schopenhauer in with the existentialists of the 20th century. I don't know how much he was really I mean, the discourse around the meaning of life was fairly new, and I don't know how proliferant it actually was by the time Schopenhauer was writing, which I think a lot of people take for granted that philosophers have always been writing about like what's the meaning of life. And it's like, yeah, we didn't even have that concept until like the very late 18th century.
Yeah,
But
it's more like they were talking more about like how do you live your life, not so much what is the meaning of it.
I look at Schopenhauer as kind of a system builder. I don't know
And
how you feel about that. I don't know that he was as much of a system builder as someone like Hegel, but I think it's kind of inevitable. He came out of the same sort of German idealist sort of tradition of like, this is what philosophers are supposed to be doing. Philosophers are not supposed to be responding to these isolated questions. We're supposed to be building entire systems of thought and practice.
yeah, I mean, and to me, he's like very skeptical of the individual. And I mean, he basically says individualism is the source of evil, right? So, and to me, like the meaning of life discourse is all tied up in individualism and expressing like the inner self in some way. So I don't know if
Mm.
I just don't see him as an existentialist. Feel like he's very caught up in like communal ways of viewing life. Schopenhauer basically says exactly what you said: to replicate the entire essence of the world abstractly, generally, and distinctly in concepts, and thus deposit it as reflected image in lasting and constantly available concepts of reason. This and nothing other is philosophy.
Well, I mean, on the individualism question, I think maybe it might be good to just kind of give like sort of the skeleton of Schopenhauer's sort of philosophical system, which I think can arguably be said to begin with this criticism of what he calls the principle of individuation, right? And I mean, he uses the Latin term throughout the world as well as representation. But yeah, the principle of individuation he sees as a source of problems, and his sort of moral philosophy is kind of a an antithesis of that principle. And so basically the principle of individuation is this idea where we see ourselves as separate from other people. And the solution that I think Schopenhauer kind of offers is interesting because what he wants people to be doing is he wants people to be acting compassionately. And he wants people to be acting compassionately from a specific motivation. So he's taking very much like I think he's taking some kind of deontological position. Would you agree?
Yeah, if not deontological, at least highly inspired by what Kant says, right? Because Kant has the same kind of idea that, like, if you're not acting from a principle, then it's not true goodness.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I mean, what he takes from Kant and what happens when Kant comes into contact with Schopenhauer, I think, is a whole other thing because Schopenhauer is like a lot of philosophers, he takes a lot from Kant, but then goes on to criticize other aspects. Like he criticizes Kant for being too rational. And I think you and I both know people that who describe themselves as anti-rationalists that seem to really like Schopenhauer. I think that has something to do with it.
Yeah. So maybe, all right. So I want to go through kind of this argument and I'll point out because I think one of his key points will elucidate exactly why he disagrees with Kant here. So his central question here with morality is like, we know that we have morality. We know that there is good through a kind of intuitive experience. But the issue is that morality doesn't provide its own motivation. And so we have no reason to do what's good because we have self-love that affects everything that we do. Like everything seems to be presented to us as a way of furthering our own existence. So how can morality fit into this kind of universe, right? How can this intuitive?
mhm,
So then he distinguishes between abstract cognizance and intuitive cognizance. And he says the problem is we're trying to understand morality through abstract cognizance. This is what Kant's doing, right? He's trying to understand like these principles of reason. But the problem with principles of reason is that they don't provide motivation for doing what we do. They can't provide what
mhm.
Kant recognizes that. He has to come up with this like moral sense or moral feeling in order to get people in his system to even want to do good. So Schopenhauer's response is like, let's forget that abstract cognizance completely. And let's just think about intuitive cognizance, which means the only way that we can know what's good is through some inner recognition of our essence, which would be the will, right? The
Mhm.
will that is driving everyone to go. Well, then what does that will mean? Well, if we follow the will, we're going to be acting in self love, right? Because the will strives to survive, it's the will to life. So, what can good be if it's always going to be motivated by the self love? Well, it has to be the negation of that self love. So, that would be getting rid of the principle of individuation, right? You have to get rid of that in order to be good. Because if you continuously follow this self will, you're always going to do things for their own like mediated worth rather than being good in themselves. So I think that would be his overall argument.
I think we could also cash it out that he's not necessarily he's not beginning and ending with the problem of self-love. It's he's beginning, I think, with what we conceptualize as the self. Like on the principle of individuation, when we're acting from that principle, I'm myself and you're yourself, and everyone else is this separate self. And I think this is something that he's trying to take from the Eastern texts that he reads, which includes like the Upanishads specifically. And he seems to like this idea of like, well, we're all actually one. There is actually just this one self, and I am that. So it's almost like I wonder if we could cash it out as not that self love is the problem, but that the self that I love is just myself. So, what I should be doing is I should expand my concept of who is the self that I love. And I should extend that concept of the self to everyone so that in this way, I I still have self love, but I have it for everyone because everyone is one with me.
So I think this gets tricky because I agree. Like he's saying, if you want to be good, that would be like the consequence of being good. Are we actually doing this because we want to reckon like does it come merely from recognition or is there some kind of like third factor here, right? Because he says that like the average person is never going to reach this kind of understanding. They just
Hmm.
aren't. It's like a virtue. It's more like an Aristotelian virtue. Like you either are good or you're not. You'll have the ability to discern these things and live them out, or you won't. And this is kind of like the person with this intuitive cognizance, they'll just end up recognizing that. And then this is just like the consequence of them recognizing it. I don't know how much ought starts to figure in his thought. Like he doesn't seem to be moralizing too much to me. But that's just my interpretation.
I think I tend to read Schopenhauer as really emphasizing recognition, like everything follows from an idea.
Mm-hmm.
It follows from a mindset.
Yeah.
And maybe when I'm saying that I read Schopenhauer in that way, maybe what I'm actually really referring to is I think arguably this is the way that at least as so insofar as he appears in the annals of pop philosophy today, this is how most people are reading Schopenhauer. And this is more importantly, this is how people are presenting Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer's philosophy is at least on like the internet and stuff is almost never presented in its full argumentative structure. You're getting like cool little quips and cool little perspective shifts that Schopenhauer has to offer. Like you see all these videos like we all live in a prison, how Schopenhauer helps you live a better life.
Yeah.
Like they focus on the shift in perception that is supposed to then result in, I guess, hopefully a shift in the way that you relate to yourself, to your life, to other people. I'm not saying any of that is necessarily a bad thing. Um, I think maybe a couple of years ago I was a little bit more critical of that sort of attitude, but now I guess I don't know. Maybe I just don't. It just doesn't bother me as much anymore because maybe I look at it as like, look, if this is what people are pulling from this guy and it's helping them live a better life, I mean, who cares? You
But
know?
it's like it's so opposed to what he says. Like right here, he says abstract dogmas in fact have no influence on virtue. Like those are abstract dogmas, putting him into this like kind of like self-help guy, right? Um on goodness and disposition. Those are false. Those that are false do not disturb it, and those that are true unlikely to promote it. So it doesn't matter if you research all of what Schopenhauer wrote, it's not going to change you. All it does is provide them with a schema, a formula, in accordance with which his own faculty of reason can be given an account. So at best, you're going to have like some kind of formula in which to judge your actions, but that's it. It's not going to make you good.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't even know if people are looking to Schopenhauer for a guidance to be good, especially because, like I said, he tends to get lumped in with existentialists now.
It's not
And
even going to show you to a
yeah.
good. It won't even show you to a good life. It won't. Like it's not going to do anything.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I don't think people are looking to Schopenhauer to live a good life. I think they're looking to him to live like as a therapist, kind of
Oh, like almost like
how to
more
be
like
happy.
psychoanalysis, psychoanalysis or whatever.
Um, Probably more ego psychology than psychoanalysis, I guess. But yeah, because it's more about like yeah, because which is kind of ironic, I guess, right?
Yeah, but then he would say, for these people would only indeed be concerned for themselves, for their egoism, just like the bandit, for whom they are distinguished only by the absurdity of their means, right? Like, okay, so you're looking at Schopenhauer for life advice, but you're no different than the person who looks to God for life advice. The only difference is your means, you're different God, you're
Well,
different
yeah, and
hope.
this is what I've said this to people, I think many times that philosophy has come to replace religion for a lot of people, but the same people who tend to look to philosophy as a replacement for religion usually end up being the same people that like they are obsessed with like Nietzsche and the God is dead stuff, and it's like I don't know, it's like how do you not pick up on the irony as you're doing this?
Right. Like he doesn't even care about happiness.
No.
Like he mentions it like once, and all he says is like something like the rich man will be just as unhappy um following hit like he basically well let me see if I can find it. um Let us suppose happy state of person is only a phenomenon and deception of Maya, mediated by the principle of individuation, a beggar's happy dream. All right, let me read the full quote. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
The significance of the great ethical distinction among characters is that the evil person is infinitely far from attaining to cognizance from which denial of the will proceeds, and is therefore in truth actually prey to all the torments that appear possible in life. For even the present, let us suppose happy state of his person is only a phenomenon and deception of Maya. Like happiness is only a dream. Like there's no real happiness for anyone. And
Well,
then
there,
he's
yeah, I mean, there's no lasting happiness.
yeah, any happiness is just the cool spot in a burning circle of coals.
Well,
And
yeah,
then
and when you look at
and
him through the lens of like the Eastern stuff, it's like every happiness is undercut by something, whether it's the the accompaniment of yeah, you're happy now, but this is going to be taken away from you at some point, or yeah, you're happy now, but this is actually just creating a new source of craving for you in the future. So every pleasure is undercut by something else, according to the karmic system.
okay, so that leads me to another issue because I feel like Buddhism, I had the same question, which is like a lot of people take rebirth and this kind of like hanging on to life after death as a metaphor. But then it's like, so let's assume that it's metaphorical. Well, why follow a Schopenhauer or a Buddha and renounce this life if all this is metaphorical? And if like you live your whole life happy attaining these physical goods, who cares if there is no afterlife? Like why should you care?
I mean, I don't know how much he takes from Buddhism as much as Hinduism.
Oh, well, this chapter 68 is full of Buddhist references. In fact, he says Buddha is one of the prime examples of what he's talking about, the sage who self-denies.
Well, I think the thing with the Buddha is that, I mean, the Buddha forged sort of this middle path, right? I mean, the Buddha went through this phase, I think it was like 7 years or something, where he lived the ascetic lifestyle, the complete renunciate path. Um, and then what he concluded was that this didn't bring him any closer to enlightenment than like so Buddha starts out as this wealthy prince. He lives very comfortably. Then he goes through this experience where he finds out that life is, not perfect. Um, and this leads him to kind of go to this other extreme of like, well, I want to cut myself off completely from any kind of pleasure. And I'm going to go and hang out with these other renunciates and deprive myself of the comforts of shelter, food, sex, all that stuff, possessions. And he does that for a number of years. And then he's kind of sitting around with these guys and just being like, hey, is anybody else enlightened yet? No? Okay, I'm going to go off and do my own thing and figure this out. So he sits under the Bodhi tree and I'm not getting up until I get enlightened. And what he comes up with is that maybe going from one extreme to the other is part of the problem. And so he says like it's not so much about like it's not so much about renouncing everything, it's more about like trying to live more in moderation. So sometimes that's why people sometimes call Buddhism the middle path or the middle way or whatever.
So
I
I
think
wonder if
Schopenhauer
Schopenhauer,
is kind of focusing on the second chapter of Buddha's life and forgetting about the third chapter.
actually, I think he kind of, at least from this chapter 68, it seems like he anticipates that because he talks about the stages of asceticism. He says it starts with giving up sex, and then it starts with and then you proceed to giving up all your possessions, and then he says you start mortifying your body, and then he says for the first time after you've done all that, you finally abstractly and pure of anything mythical achieve the inner essence of saintliness, self-renunciation, the killing of self-will. So finally you reach the kind of like mental version of that. And
Well,
I
I
wonder
mean,
if
the way
like so
I
it's
mean,
sorry, real quick. Let me just finish this thought. Like, I think there's a way of reading Buddhism, especially Theravada, where Buddha's ultimate revelation is not so much that asceticism is not the way to go, but that asceticism is not the way to get other people to renounce. And in order for you to do that, you must have compassion. And that's the third, or that's the middle way, which is becoming compassionate and coming back in order to get other people to renounce living this kind of life of clinging. That's my interpretation.
Yeah, I mean it could be, and I mean, yeah, there's different strains of thought within Buddhism. Obviously, it's not a monolithic belief system.
Yeah.
But like, I mean, the way that Schopenhauer is describing the Buddha's enlightenment, it almost sounds like he's still advocating for this idea that the Buddha's enlightenment was ultimately a result of his ascetic practices. But I'm not aware of I'm that's not a reading that I'm very familiar with. It's almost like the opposite. Like by walking away from that extreme as well,
So let's
you
go
know.
back to what he says at the beginning, though, and maybe we can derive our own kind of interpretation of it. Because I'm wondering when he says that, right, abstract dogmas, in fact, have no influence on virtue. They are only a schema in accordance to which one's own faculty of reason can be given account. I think what he's saying is that if we put that to the Buddha had to go through this kind of aesthetic Hindu kind of philosophy in his early life in order to you have something to judge his natural intuition against. He was stuck in
Yeah,
that past.
I think that's
He,
fair.
he was indulging in all these things. He was never going to be able to have these revelations. He'd never be under that Bodhi tree had he not seen those like four signs. I forget what they were, and then try
Hmm.
this. He just it wouldn't have happened. He had to go through that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of implicit in the story.
Yeah, I'm trying to be generous to Schopenhauer.
See, I mean, this is like the open question of like how much is he getting from Eastern philosophy and how much is he looking at Eastern philosophy and saying, "Oh, somebody agrees with me." You know, I think maybe it might be hard to know like which came first, and I'm not sure how much that question really matters, but I do see a little bit of overlap between this idea that he has of will as the world. And like, you know, there's this idea in like Hindu cosmology that like the universe came into existence because of desire. This is what desire is what brings things into creation and what keeps things in creation. It's what creates, preserves, and destroys. And so I kind of see some overlap between his concept of like the will as this pervasive force through everything that is not only bringing things into being, but is also preserving things that are already in being. And
Mhm,
so you have like this macrocosmic level of the force, or sorry, the will as this
mhm.
force throughout nature, and then this microcosmic instance of it in individual people who are going about their lives, doing everything they can to hang on to this state of being. Um, but Schopenhauer's solution to the will is, I think, can be distinguished from like maybe the Stoics' response to the will. Because like the will is a problem. I mean, however you want to slice it, the will creates problems because what we want to do does not always improve our situation. Like, even if we're just looking at it in those very bare terms, like what I want to do is not always good for me, even by my own standards, you know, and yet I do that which I will not to do, you know, as St. Paul said, right? So we've got to do something about the will. And so you have some people that want to say, like, we need to regulate the will, we need to redirect the will towards better ends, which I guess you could see that with like the Stoics. And then you have Schopenhauer who says, why don't we just, you know, instead of cutting off the branches, why don't we chop the tree down? You know, why don't we just get rid of the will? We won't have to worry about redirecting it or regulating it.
So you're bringing up a lot of things I've been thinking about. So I really liked how you broke that down because I think this is why he feels akin to the Buddha because I feel like Buddha views the will primarily as or sorry, suffering as primarily the main issue with life, right? But then we think about the Stoics and the Cynics, and they don't view it that way. And I think maybe Christianity doesn't either. And so you kind of have these two kind of branches of thought as regarding like both agree that will's a problem, but I think like the Schopenhauer and Buddha view is like this problem's more fundamental to the creation, whereas the Stoics, the Christians, and the Cynics are more like, no, it's more of like a problem with us as individuals rather than a problem with the entirety of creation, right? Does that make
Hmm.
sense?
Yeah.
And so, because like, and I think Hegesias, who we talked about last time, he would be more in line with the Schopenhauer view, where it's like this is a fundamental problem with existence. Like you can't, we have happiness, but happiness is impossible. So we have to do something about that. The structure of life is just set up to where we can't succeed. Whereas, like, I think the Christians, like Augustine, their view is like we have the flesh and the spirit. Spirit is pure, it's good. The universe is structured on spirit. It's the word of God. God created the world with providence. And so if there's any issue with the will, it's an individual problem. I think the Stoics have the same concept, right? There's a divine providence in the world that goes through everything. The world's created fine. The issue is you and your perception of the world. And
Hmm.
the Cynics were like the precursors to the Stoics, and their idea was like the problem is we're focusing on all these things that we don't need. We need to simplify our lives, and if we only focus on the pleasures that are natural to us and not these unnatural pleasures that arise from like living in a society, then we will live the good life. We'll have happiness. So one side thinks happiness is unattainable. The other thinks happiness is only unattainable because there's an issue with our perspective. And I think Schopenhauer is more on that left side.
Yeah, definitely. Well, this brings up, I think, too, kind of the weirdness of seeing Schopenhauer lumped in with like Camus and Sartre, like, you know,
Because I think they're more on the right side of it. The idea
yeah,
that like the problems are perspective, right?
yeah. But then Camus has this weird line, which I've always, well, it's not even a line; it's a footnote that I've always detested, because it's just a pure ad hominem. It's in the myth of Sisyphus, where he criticizes Schopenhauer for praising suicide while sitting at a well-seated table.
Yeah, I don't think his view on suicide is pretty nuanced. I didn't go through 69 again, but
Oh yeah, no, he's not praising suicide. Like Camus is just wrong about that. But
because
it's
I
like,
know
yeah.
he would think suicide is main. I'm guessing from what I can remember is that he would think suicide's like a affirmation of the principle of individualism for the most part, but
Hmm.
it could be a self-denial that's good.
Yeah, I mean that goes into like a whole other territory. But yeah, I think you're right about that. And yeah, chapter 69 definitely clarifies that, I think, more. But yeah, I think you're right about that.
Right here,
Um,
there seems to be a particular sort of suicide entirely distinct from the ordinary. It is voluntary elected starvation arising from the highest degree of asceticism, the phenomenon of which, however, has already been accompanied by much religious enthusiasm and even superstition, and thereby obscured. So I think you would say like a monk who's like burning himself to protest Vietnam is a good suicide.
yeah, I think so. I think he would agree with that.
Yeah. So yeah, it is a huge trauma.
Yeah. um, but he definitely does, like you said, he definitely takes that left view of looking at it at the will and the pursuit of happiness as a fundamentally unattainable goal and a fundamental problem. And I think, like we saw with Hegesias, I'm wondering if we're seeing a pattern here where maybe that sort of starting point of your philosophy is what takes a person to such an extreme conclusion, whether it's starving ourselves to death or in Schopenhauer's case, it's like we have to annihilate the will, not
Mhm.
through literal suicide, but basically everything up to that.
I mean, because he doesn't go to the extreme where I think he's like praising suicide, like people the way people want to paint him. But I think you're right.
Hmm.
He does seem to think it has more power than maybe what a Buddha or a Hindu philosopher would take from it, right?
Yeah, well, and I mean his goal is different from theirs too. I mean, like I mean, he doesn't believe in an afterlife. He doesn't believe in God or anything like that. So his goal is completely like it's completely different from what a religious ascetic would be doing asceticism for. You know what I mean? Um,
Well, maybe not with Buddhism though, because it's hard to say. I don't know if they believe in gods or the afterlife necessarily.
well, when I say that, I'm trying to encompass both like Eastern and Western asceticism because he does draw on both. Like he talks about like Saint John of the Cross, for example. Um, and that's another guy too. Like, have you read Dark Knight of the Soul before?
No,
Oh my God, it's so good.
I'll have to read it.
It's so good.
Um,
But there's one anecdote that Saint John of the Cross talks about. Like the whole theme of Dark Knight of the Soul is this idea that your relationship with God is like it's like it's supposed to mature, and even when you're doing like rigorous self-denial, like that's supposed to mature. Like he talks about this one anecdote about this monk he knew who was like really attached to this crucifix. It was like a shoddy crucifix made of like twigs or something. So, he gets to have, you get your ascetic points. Like I don't even bestow upon myself a fancy crucifix. I just give myself my little twigs. But then that becomes its own problem because now you've got sort of this air about you, like, look at me with my little twig crucifix. And he talks about how this one monk kind of went through this stage of like eventually like getting rid of even that, and he's like, now I don't even have this. But I don't know, like what I mean, it's so hard to tell. Like that's what's so tricky about asceticism. Um, is like it's so hard to determine, even within oneself, like what your motive is.
as I was kind of talking to you about that argument between Erasmus and Luther about works and how important works were.
Mm-hmm.
And Schopenhauer talks a lot about works in this chapter, and he's saying like the only way that we can really recognize if someone is good and if they're self-denying, if they're a true aesthetic, is by what they do. And like
Mm.
them just saying that they believe these things or them having some abstract concept of it is not going to show anything about them. Works is the only way that we can comprehend this. And this is because our understanding of morality is not coming from abstract reasoning. So I think when we look at like aestheticism and what its focus is, it's like I think that ultimately is what it comes down to is that works are the main way in which we perceive people's relation to this kind of greater good. And if we don't see that, then it's all for naught. You have to do it.
Yeah, which I mean, Schopenhauer doesn't.
Mm-hmm. But I don't think his goal is to be the sage. His goal is just
No,
to
I don't think it is either. Yeah, I don't think he presents himself as like I'm doing this and then like laughing like haha, they think I'm an ascetic, I don't.
right. His goal is just to see it. He's trying to describe the world that he's in, and I'm not the kind I don't care if a philosopher's a hypocrite. I don't know about you, but
No, I really don't care either, to be honest. I care whether their ideas are tenable.
you
It's like it's that old saying of like, well, if you're not going to take your own advice, I guess I'll take it.
from all I know about Schopenhauer, he's a piece of shit. But I like his writing, and he's dead, long good dead. So like, I don't really care what he was like. All I care about is this book. But I mean, there are reasons to view people as extensions of their lives, so that's not black and white. My last thought is just like I think ultimately he is more coming down the Christian side of things,
Hmm.
despite his references to Eastern philosophy. I just think you're right though. He like clearly is an atheist, so I think that's part of why we get this kind of hopelessness from him. Not that atheism leads to hopelessness necessarily, But I think
Right.
when you use suffering as a problem combined with atheism, you kind of get like there's no afterlife, there's no city of God to build or look forward to. There's no like providence to look forward to. So you get like all the worst parts of Augustine without the the hopeful parts.
I will say one of the things that I have come to really like about Schopenhauer, he reaches across to look for some other belief system that can validate what he feels and what he's experienced, and he finds that in a variety of places, like you pointed out, Buddhism, Hinduism, also some Christian ascetics. I like that personally, like, because that's something that I would like to see more of. I'd like to see more of a dialogue between Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy, and I'd also like to see people start realizing that there already is a dialogue. There already have been people from both sides. Like, it's not just Schopenhauer going over and looking at this stuff and saying, "Oh wow, this is cool. I'm going to come use this to support my ideas." I genuinely think that his um I don't know, admiration of these other figures that he studied is real and genuine.
Mhm.
Um and it's unfortunate when I see people kind of criticize him for being like, I don't know, like I've heard people like criticize him for being like Orientalist or whatever,
I mean, that's
but
just how people are going to be now. I mean,
exactly.
they fail to realize that one, these people have a handful of texts that they have. Like their knowledge is so limited compared to what we know, and their ability to communicate with people from these places is so limited that it's really hard to blame them for having superficial readings. And honestly, I don't think he has a superficial reading. I think he just has maybe a limited reading, right? And then I think the other thing is that ultimately, I mean, it's very hard to say like what parts of Buddhism and Hinduism influence Western philosophy and what parts of Western philosophy influence Buddhism and Hinduism. Like it's just we don't know.
Hmm.
It's, I think it's almost more offensive to treat them as separate spheres than like just try to understand their similarities. And I think with that intention, Schopenhauer is doing the right thing.
Oh yeah, I agree 1000% with that.
And I want to say like one last thing too, because I just had a thought. Like we've been engaging with a lot of these Hegelians and German ideologists inspired people. But like when I look at Schopenhauer, one thing that always was refreshing to me is like I feel like he uses real arguments and he has like a real clear system. And I feel like for
Yeah.
the continental like idealist tradition, I feel like he is one of the better ones philosophically.
You know,
67, 68, 69. It's like a very clear, direct argument where he's going. Like I don't think he really fucks it up too much.
no, I mean, I feel like you get the skeleton key to his more or less his whole philosophical worldview in these
Hmm.
chapters.
Yeah. And even the will, it's like kind of abstract and weird, but like, you know, I get what he's saying. Like, even if the concept itself is not clear, like he derives the way he derives things from it is not like in this purely abstract way. Like I don't feel like a Hegelian philosopher explaining being to me, where it's kind of like you just got to do it in order to understand the philosophy. Like
Just
no,
draw the triangle.
he explains his philosophy. Like we can get it even if you aren't familiar with.
He basically is like, if this doesn't work, you've got this whole other side of the world that's doing what I'm doing, and you can go over there and see what they've been up to for thousands of years, and you'll see that I'm not crazy, you know.
Right. Yeah, he puts it through several different iterations of the same idea so that if one doesn't work for you, you have another one that might resonate with you.